So in this video, I want to talk about the 3/5 compromise because I think it's important for students to understand it, because in some ways people understand it really well, and in other ways people don't understand it at all. There's like a common myth about it that I want to clear up. So let's talk about this. First, the 3/5 compromise, the language of the 3/5 compromise is right on the screen. And I'm going to read it. And as is often the case when you read the Constitution, it has to be translated into English because otherwise it makes no sense. And so this is what the 3/5 compromise actually, the words say. Representatives, and they're talking solely about the House of Representatives, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Okay, I know that doesn't make any sense, but let me break it down for you, because basically that's just a math formula. That's just a math formula for how are we going to count the population of a state. And this was hotly debated. How are we going to count the population of a state? And more importantly, not how, but who are we going to count as part of the population of a state? And so what that unclear sentence means in terms of a math formula is the population of a state, and this was in the Constitution, is going to equal all of the free people plus all of the indentured servants. That's that phrase, those bound to a service for a term of years. All the free people plus the indentured servants plus 3/5 of all the slaves. That's all that says. Now, before we continue on with our analysis here, I want you to think about the significance of how you count the population of a state. The larger the population of a state is, the more representation that state is going to get in the House, not in the Senate, right? The Senate, every state gets 2 senators. The more representation they're going to get in the House. And what I mean by more representation, they're going to have more representatives in the House if the population is larger as opposed to if the population is smaller. And if you have more representation, that is more members of the House of Representatives, then you're going to have more power to shape policy. You're going to have more votes to make sure that either the policies that your state wants are going to get adopted, or you can prevent policies that are going to hurt your state from being adopted. Well, it isn't obvious by just looking at it, but the 3/5 compromise essentially ensured the continued enslavement of human beings. I'm going to try and explain why, and it's a little bit complicated, but I think if you follow along, this will make sense. When the first House representatives met, there were a total of 65 representatives. 65 representatives, okay? That's an important number to remember. What I did is I went and I looked back at the 1790 census, the first census that they used to count the population of the various states. And what I wanted to see was what was the impact of counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. What did that do? So the first thing I did is I said, okay, there's 65 representatives. If we count the population of the states and we divide 65 into those 13 states, but we only count the free people, the states that had slaves, and by that I mean where 15% of the population or more were slaves. If representation was based solely on the population of free people, the states that had, like I say, 15% of more of their population would have had 26 representatives. 26 representatives. Meaning they would have been a minority in the House of Representatives. So the states that had way fewer slaves in their population, if they wanted to abolish slavery, they would be able to do so. They could pass that in the House because the slave states, and in this case, I'm just arbitrarily calling it any state that has a population where 15% or more of their population was slaves, right? They would only have 26 votes. But when representation was based on the 3/5 compromise, when 3/5 of the slaves were added into it, and I calculated how many representatives the states that had where 15% of their population or more was slaves, they would have 33 votes, 33 representatives. And suddenly, what happens? Now those states have a majority. Now those states have the ability to ensure that any attempt to reduce or eliminate slavery is going to get voted down because those states now comprise a majority in the House of Representatives. That's what the 3/5 compromise did. It essentially ensured that states that had slaves, and I'm just using 15% as my cutoff, states that had slaves were going to comprise a majority, and they would be able to prevent anything from passing that was going to reduce slavery. That's just part of our Constitution. That was part of the compromise that the framers reached. The 3/5 compromise ensured the continued enslavement of human beings because it ensured that states that had slaves were going to comprise a majority of the House of Representatives. So that's important to understand. But there's also a popular misconception or misinterpretation of the 3/5 compromise that I want to talk about. And to do so, I actually, oddly enough, need the help of Tom Hanks.
Hello, I'm Tom Hanks, and I want Barack Obama to be the next president of our country. As official celebrity, I know my endorsement has just made your mind up for you. History with a capital H is going to be made this November, no matter who the president-elect is. I want Barack Obama to be president of this country, a country that once said that people of his skin color were only 3/5 of a human being.
That phrase that he says at the very end, that's the part that I want to talk about. A country that once viewed people of his skin color as 3/5 of a human being. This is the common misinterpretation of the 3/5 compromise. So the implication in Tom Hanks' remark is that this is terrible. I mean, think about it. The idea that people would be counted as 3/5 of a human being sounds awful, right? And the implication of his statement, and probably what a lot of you learned in high school, was that it would have been better if slaves had been counted as a full human being. That would have been preferential. Now keep in mind, slaves were slaves. No matter how they were counted, they weren't treated humanely. They were killed with impunity. They were treated as property. They had zero rights whatsoever. And so the argument that they should have been counted as a full human being is problematic because if you think about it, which states supported the enslavement of human beings? The North or the South? Well, the South did. I mean, there were probably some Northerners who supported it as well, but for the most part, the South supported the enslavement of human beings. They fought a civil war over that. Which states wanted to count the enslaved human beings? Which states wanted to count the enslaved as human beings? The North or the South? The South wanted to count them as human beings. They didn't want to count them as 3/5 of a human being. They wanted to count them as a full human being. The North didn't think they should be counted at all. Why would you give the South more representation in a democratic system because they engage in the most undemocratic of practices, the enslavement of human beings? Now, if you're thinking, whoa, this is like the opposite of what I was taught, right? Because I'm sure many of you were. I want you to look at this example and you'll see what I mean. We know what the 3/5 compromise says, right? So imagine we're coming up with an example. What's the population of a state that has 100 free people and 100 slaves? We're going to leave indentured servants out of this because it doesn't change the equation. If you use the 3/5 compromise, a state that has 100 free people and 100 slaves, their population would be 160, right? The 100 free people plus 3/5 of 100 slaves is 60. So 100 plus 60 is 160. Tom Hanks' suggestion that it would have been better essentially to count slaves as a full human being. What would the population of a state be if that's what they did? Well, it would be 100 free people plus 100 slaves. The population would have been 200. More than would have been the case under the 3/5 compromise. And that's the point. Who would have benefited the most from counting slaves as full human beings? The South would have. The South would have benefited the most. The 3/5 compromise didn't. It's hard to think about the 3/5 compromise as saying that people of Barack Obama's skin color were 3/5 of a human being when the people who were okay with the enslavement of human beings wanted to count them as a full person. That's not what the 3/5 compromise did. It didn't say black people were 3/5 of a human being. It had solely to do with representation in the House. And the people who wanted to count slaves as a full human being didn't want to give them any rights, didn't want to give them any freedom, certainly didn't want to let them vote. They were slaves. They wanted to count them as full people in order to maintain the institution of slavery. And that's important to keep in mind because people frequently misunderstand what this part of the Constitution says. Now, I know some of you are probably wrestling with that and like thinking, man, this is not what I learned, but it is the case. And so if you have any questions about that, put them on the discussion board and we can discuss it further. Also, if you see down there at the bottom of this page, if you're interested in the Electoral College, there's a great interview with a professor who talks about it in more detail. If you just click on the link below, you can study more about it. But this is going to conclude our discussion of the Constitution.